Hi, and welcome into the Cool Grandpa podcast. I'm excited to have you join myself and Rick Capriola to talk about updated information regarding substance use and abuse amongst middle school and high school youth. Now, Rick has been on the show before, and we talked about his book, The Addicted Child. And this time around, what we're doing is talking about that updated data that's coming from a University of Michigan study. And this is a great way to inform yourself and inform your family about what the trends are as far as drug and alcohol use amongst those middle school and high school kids. The other thing I want to talk to you about and just remind you is that I've got Buy Me a Coffee, where you can go and you can donate a few dollars to the show. That helps to offset some of the cost of producing and publishing the podcast. Anything that's donated, I really do appreciate. The last thing I want to remind you is that I have a 4-part course called Intentional Grandfathering that is going to be hosted and released through Grandparents Academy. That will be happening this May. It'll be a 4-part course with time for Q&A after the courses. So week 1, you'll get module 1, then there'll be a time for Q&A, and then week 2, week 3, week 4, etc. So check out the show notes for the links for Buy Me a Coffee, as well as for Grandparents Academy in the course that I am going to be hosting. Without further ado, let's jump into this conversation. Hello, and welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is your host, Greg Payne, coming at you from Studio 12. This podcast is about being the best possible grandpa you can be, focusing on what it is to be a grandpa and how we can all share that experience together for our grandchildren. Hi, Rick. Thank you so much for being on the Cool Grandpa Podcast. I'm excited to have another conversation with you, and an important conversation for a lot of grandparents, so that we can help them understand what's going on with substance abuse and use with the youth of today. And you've brought some great statistics and updated information to us, so I appreciate that.
Thank you, Greg. It's a pleasure to be here to talk a little bit about this important issue of adolescent substance abuse, which I know can be a scary topic for a lot of parents and grandparents. But I think that knowledge is power, and the more we know about it, the less afraid we are of it, and hopefully feel a little bit more confident that if we have to face this situation, we know what to do.
Yes, having the right information is going to be very empowering, because I can just imagine, and in some of my questions, I was even referencing some of my old health classes from the 80s. And so I know if I was to sit down and my grandson and granddaughters were, 12, 13, 14 years old, and I started talking to them about the stoners and a lot of the imagery that was being used in the 80s, they would look at me like I was from Mars or something compared to what's going on.
You're talking a different language.
Absolutely. So this is great information for us. Before we get started, some of the statistics and the summary of the research that you sent out to us, can you talk a little bit about where this comes from, how the research was collected, and how they update this on a pretty regular basis?
Yeah, this is a national survey that's been going on for 30, 40 years. It's conducted by the University of Michigan. It's called Monitoring the Future. And every year around early part of the year, they come out with new data that reflects information that they have obtained over the past school year. So they look at 3 different grade levels, 8, 10, and 12. They survey a random sample of students in those grades. And then they gather information from the feedback on what drugs kids are using, how often they're using them. They also get an assessment of their attitude about drugs. Do they, for example, see drugs as very harmful? And if so, which drugs do they think are harmful? And then they also get information on how available these drugs are. So again, this is information that's coming back from the kids themselves. And then that data is compiled and released every year at the beginning of the year. So they have a long history of data about adolescent substance abuse, and they can see the trends from year to year.
Okay, that's helpful. And I imagine a lot of this data goes out to experts like yourself dealing with substance use and abuse, as well as probably the school systems as well.
I don't know that it's distributed, directly to clinicians and to school districts. It is data that's available on their website.
Okay.
And I would suspect that a number of clinicians and school counselors might be aware of it.
Okay. Okay. So, probably not something that shows up in the high school counselor's email inbox, but something that's available for the school district or whoever would want to get access to this.
I think so. I wish every school counselor reviewed it every year, because it really does provide a good in-depth review of what's going on with adolescent substance abuse. And I just think every counselor probably should take the time to look at this information. It's always very enlightening to take a look at it.
Because not only would it give you the trends of what's going on nationally, but it might help you understand what's going on locally at your district level and in your school even.
And it'll allow you to see which drugs are becoming more popular, whether they're on the increase or decrease. And I think it also will give you an insight into kids' attitudes about these drugs. Do they think they're harmful? How easy is it to get them? And unfortunately, some of that data is rather shocking.
Yeah. No, I imagine so. And we'll definitely be diving into this. One of the items that really jumped out and that you pointed out when we were communicating was really the dip that happened between 2020 and 2021, and then the uptick in use. I'm going to say use and abuse, but the use coming back up. So certainly, we ran into COVID. A lot of school districts were locked down. A lot of kids went home. And I think the data kind of shows that when they're not socializing together, some of these bad behaviors, decrease a bit. But is there anything else maybe within the data that suggests why there was that dip?
Well, I think you hit on, some of the main reasons. Kids were being sheltered at home. Many kids were doing online learning. Many peer activities were significantly curtailed. Sports activities, after school activities, kids' ability to hang out with their peers was significantly curtailed. So I think the environment was constrained. It was restricted, and that's why we saw such a dramatic decrease in substance abuse among teens. An example is that the pandemic really resulted in the largest one-year decline in marijuana use among teenagers in the past 48 years. So it was a dramatic decline, but it wasn't just marijuana. Alcohol use declined, non-prescription drugs declined, vaping declined. So the pandemic really curtailed these kids' ability, not their desire, but their ability, to get their hands on these substances. And then a year after the pandemic, what did we see? We saw a rebound. Alcohol use, sadly, went back to just the way it was before the pandemic. So we doubt very much that the pandemic had any long-term long-term effect on curtailing alcohol use among teenagers. And some of these other drugs showed not very dramatic, but maybe slight increases. It'll take a couple of years of data to determine if that trend after the pandemic is starting to move up year after year. But the initial indication is that alcohol use returned to pre-pandemic levels. Marijuana use increased slightly. And some of the other drugs, inhalants, hallucinogens, cocaine, heroin, they all showed slight increases in 2022, as did non-prescribed use of drugs like Ritalin and Adderall. Interestingly, what we noticed was that the prescribed use of ADHD medications, those being prescribed by a doctor, rose significantly in 2022. And it's likely that two things are likely. One is that the increased need for ADHD prescribed medications increased during the pandemic due to stress. These kids were under a lot of stress. And it's also possible that because these teens were sheltered at home, parents might have become more aware of their child's attention deficit and sought out medical attention, which then resulted in the increase in prescribed drugs for ADHD.
Okay. And this next question, I'm just going to ask you to think about this. I'm not necessarily trying to lead anywhere, but could we also have imagined as well what the increase of the drugs and the prescriptions for ADHD, that the coping mechanisms that some of the kids may have developed in a classroom setting weren't there. And to your point, you know, they're out of a different situation. They're at home. There's fidgeting. There's more distractions and all of that. And versus, okay, they've been used to a structured environment, and they've been able to cope and come up with different mechanisms within that environment, so that they really didn't maybe need those meds.
That's possible. You know, it's possible that the environment, that they were in before the pandemic might have, somewhat suppressed those behaviors. In other situations, the behaviors might have been there all along, but it took something like the pandemic and being confined at home to bring it out, so that parents noticed it more. Usually teachers can pick up on it pretty quickly, though. So I suspect that there might have been some of this ADHD that was going on anyway. Maybe not as severe. Maybe what happened was that the pandemic increased it a little bit more than what might have been otherwise.
Oh, sure. And this is all, we're kind of guessing and kind of reading the data to try to see what's going on and what makes sense. One question I did have, though, is do you know what benefit, if any, does taking some of these drugs like Ritalin, Adderall have for somebody that really doesn't have ADHD?
Well, they're stimulants. So because they're stimulants, people are going to get a certain high from them, going to get revved up, so to speak. They're not using the drug to calm them down. Stimulants generally work by speeding you up to the point where you'll calm down. And that's why they're so effective with ADHD. They help increase concentration and slow you down a little bit. But if you don't have that disorder of ADHD, then you're taking a stimulant. There are many stimulants out there that are illicit drugs type of stimulants. But this one is a prescription medication that obviously you don't have. It's not your prescription, but you might pick it up from friends or on the street. And you're using it to get that stimulation, that high, that is pleasurable to you. You don't need it for ADHD, but you like it because of the feeling it gives you.
Sure. And, this is me putting my old guy hat on. Is I remember in high school and in college, a lot of us were using caffeine pills and Jolt Cola and some of those things. But I do know from experience with having friends at Georgia Tech, and I'm not trying to slander Georgia Tech or anything, but a lot of those kids are either they've either got the prescriptions or they're getting them from friends to help with all night cramming to, high stress midterms, finals, and muscling their way through with the use of those medications.
I think you see that at just about every university throughout the country where kids will get these non-prescribed medications, these stimulants, and they will use them exactly as you said. They will use it at exam time. They will use it during finals. They'll be staying up for all night to cram and to study, and I think that's probably one of the primary reasons why college students are using these stimulants, is to help them for their academic studies when they're, getting ready for finals or a major test.
Oh, sure. In some of that, I definitely have an understanding heart for. And then some of it, you do want to kind of talk to these guys and gals and go, hey, this could not be a good long-term thing for you. And one of the dangers that you brought out in our early communication was, the way that fentanyl is finding its way into different pills and different things. And if you're not careful about where some of the medication and some of the things you're taking, you don't know what's really inside those pills. And I'm not necessarily saying it's only from Ritalin and Adderall, but in general, when you're getting something from a friend or you're getting something off of social media or something, fentanyl is now becoming a big, big concern for a lot of overdose deaths and unfortunate consequences.
You're absolutely right. Fentanyl, while it's not a commonly used drug among teenagers, tends to be more adults. While it's not commonly used by teenagers, there is sadly an increase in overdose deaths as a result of fentanyl, which means that it's becoming a more dangerous drug. And it's important for parents and grandparents to educate teens that the pills that they buy online through social media, or the pills that they get from friends or buy from friends, may contain fentanyl. They don't know it, and the person who gives it to them might not know it, but it may contain fentanyl. So it's good for parents and grandparents to educate their children, especially their teenage children, that they need to be careful. They shouldn't take any pills at all. But unfortunately, many of these pills that can be purchased over the internet, on social media, or that kids have at school, may contain fentanyl, and that can be deadly.
You can't talk to 8th, 10th, and 12th graders and tell them a lot about some of these dangers and have them appreciate it the same way we do. But one of the things that I really liked about your book, The Addicted Child, was when you were talking about giving the information. And this is part of that, in my opinion, is, being able to have that conversation with your grandchild or your child and being able to go, hey, here's what's going on. You may not be seeing it. You may not have seen the headlines, but as grandpa, I've seen, the headlines come across the paper about the fentanyl.
Yeah. And it's important to let them know, how dangerous this is and how widespread it can be in drugs. Because, the survey that we talked about earlier, one of the things it asks kids is, how dangerous do you think drugs are? And the response that they get is, no, these kids don't think they're very harmful. If you ask them, how dangerous do you think it is to smoke marijuana? 80% of high school seniors tell us it's not a big deal. If we ask them, well, how harmful do you think it is to have 1 or 2 drinks of alcohol nearly every day? The majority of them say it's not a big deal. So they don't think these drugs are harmful. And when we ask them, okay, you don't think they're harmful, how easy is it to get these drugs? The overwhelming response is, it's no big deal. I can get it if I want it. I can get marijuana. I can get alcohol. It's no big deal. So it's a dangerous situation out there. And I don't say that to scare parents and grandparents. I say that so that we are all aware of what these kids are telling us.
Yeah. Well, and that follows a lot of my own experience when I think back to when I was in high school. and in health class or PE or whatnot, we would be shown these films. At that time, it was marijuana use.
Yeah.
And it would almost be kind of comical about, they would show somebody who had smoked a joint and this person was so out of it. And then they would be, hey, and after, so many joints or so many of these things, they're just a burnout. They can't function. They can't do anything.
Yeah.
And I remember most of us looking around going, I know a few people that are smoking marijuana, and what you're presenting to us isn't what is matching up in real life.
Yeah, because they don't believe it. I mean, this don't say no stuff and bringing kids together once in a while to bring in a police officer and tell them all this stuff about how drugs are bad for them, how illegal. They don't care about any of that stuff. They don't believe it and they don't care about it. But what I found really works, what makes a difference, is the neuroscience behind it. They don't want to hear about drugs being illegal. They already know that. They don't want to hear the threats and how it might harm them. But what they do like to learn about is the neuroscience. They're curious about the brain. So I would focus on teaching them about the brain. And then once they have a good understanding of how important the brain is, simple concepts, different areas of the brain help us to do certain things, different things, and that our brain doesn't become mature until age 24 or 25. So they get the idea that their brain is maturing and developing. Once they got that foundation of the neuroscience of it, the basics, then I would introduce to them how drugs work in the brain so that they could see how these drugs work within the brain. I would show them a picture, and I think I have this picture in my book of where marijuana attaches itself to in the brain. And you can see that it attaches itself to just about every part of the brain. When I showed them that caught their attention. So if you want to capture kids' attention about drugs, I think the best way to do it, the most effective way to do it, is through a neuroscience approach.
And that's great advice, because along with that, I have heard, and I don't remember all the statistics, but how many, a small amount of use of cocaine, and then you can become addicted to that. And different drugs have different amounts that you use. And then you've got hormones that are kicking in. You've got, effects of the brain. All of that starts to kick in, to lead to, some rather unfortunate consequences.
Unfortunately, that's true.
Now, a question that I've got for you too has to do with the marijuana legalization that's going on. Has there been any kind of a real uptick in marijuana use or acceptance as these states go through legalization?
I think the issue with the legalization of marijuana among teenagers is it gives the false notion that it's okay, that it's harmless. States are saying, okay, adults, if you want to smoke marijuana, go ahead and do it, which leaves the impression that it can't be dangerous. Okay, if states are allowing you to legally smoke marijuana, it must be not very dangerous. And my issue with that is, adults make their own decisions. They do what they want to do. The difference is in brain development. The adolescent brain is in the process of developing and maturing, and therefore is much more vulnerable to any drug, including marijuana, than, say, the adult. So there's a big difference between an adult that chooses to smoke marijuana and an adolescent that smokes marijuana. And that big difference is that the adolescent brain is much more vulnerable to being damaged. And that's the biggest risk that the adolescent takes with smoking marijuana. Now, that damage may not be readily observable. It might not be something that is obvious to parents. But if you look under the surface through testing, what I have seen is that the teenagers that I worked with who were smoking a lot of marijuana, these were very bright kids, But when the test results came back, the neuroscience and neuropsychological tests came back, what I noticed was that the processing speed of their brain was below average, their short-term memory was impaired, and their motivation was very poor. Some of these changes you would not notice as a parent or a grandparent. They're going on inside the brain. It does come out in some testing. But that has always been my primary concern, is to protect the adolescent developing brain. And I talk about that in my book so that parents and grandparents have a basic understanding of the fact that the adolescent brain is different than the adult brain. It needs to be protected from any type of assault by alcohol or marijuana or any other illicit substance.
Oh, sure. And it's interesting that how much we've come along the way as far as understanding that developmental process into being 25, because I think that was only probably last few years, decade or so, where I think it really came to light that the brain doesn't stop developing at 17, 18. It's 25.
Yes. Yeah, that's relatively new science, but it has also helped us to understand the importance of protecting that brain, in especially during those adolescent and early adulthood years.
Yeah. One thing I'm curious about with, and this is great that we're talking the brain science, is experimentation with hallucinogens. The little bit that I know about this is that hallucinogens generally aren't addictive compared to other drugs, but they may do more with interfering or affecting the brain than maybe some of the other drugs. And I may be wrong on that, but that's part of what I'm asking you questions, is because I don't know.
Well, I think you're right. We don't tend to see people becoming so-called addicted, to hallucinogens. That doesn't mean they're safe. It just means that you're unlikely to see the same type of compulsive use that you would with cocaine or with marijuana. Hallucinogens are dangerous drugs. They sometimes, for people who are vulnerable to psychosis, can flip a person into a psychotic reaction. So some of the behaviors can really get bizarre, but they are much different, as you pointed out, than, say, somebody smoking marijuana or using cocaine or any of these other drugs. Hallucinogens are just in a different category all by themselves.
Okay, that's great information to have. And it leads me into another question too, about what we're talking about some of the other drugs other than marijuana. And I know that with 12th graders in 2020, it was around 11% that were using, and it dipped, and then it's come back up to 8%, and it'll probably come back up to that 11% or so again. I'm curious to know, when do adolescents typically get exposed to harder drugs?
I think the harder drugs, the cocaines, the really hardcore drugs, I think kids get exposed to them during high school, but they don't use them to any large extent. I think what happens is these kids sort of get primed in high school by using marijuana, drinking alcohol, experimenting with different substances. And then as they get into college years or early adulthood, then they're more likely, if they haven't had an intervention, if they haven't had treatment, then I think they're more vulnerable to venturing in and experimenting with some of these harder core drugs that may be more readily available to adults than are readily available to teenagers. In the teenage population, and this has been true for decades, the primary drugs are alcohol and marijuana. Those are the two primary ones. But before the pandemic, for 3 years before the pandemic, what we had noticed was a dramatic increase in what's called vaping of nicotine and vaping of marijuana. And if you look at the data for 3 consecutive years prior to the pandemic, the increases in those kids vaping nicotine and vaping marijuana was going up like crazy. They'd moved away from nicotine, but they prefer to get their nicotine through vaping, which gives them a higher concentration of nicotine. But there's no doubt that nicotine is vaping is an issue that parents and grandparents need to be aware of in terms of it being so popular among these kids in high school.
And that was a thing where I was way too old for that when that started to become the vaping coming in, because as I was growing up, when it came to at least nicotine, right, it was cigarettes for the most part. And so it was, kids would drift off of school property so they didn't get in as much trouble if they were caught smoking. And, it was generally something where it seemed like if you really hadn't started smoking, I'm going to even say by like your junior year, so late 16, 17 years old, you really weren't going to pick it up. I mean, you might once or twice here or there type of thing, but it seemed like smoking caught on earlier. But it seems that, and maybe I'm wrong, but it seems that vaping really seems to be kicking in around the 8th grade and just exploding into your sophomore and then your seniors that are part of the study.
I think you're right. Tobacco smoking, is at an all-time low, which means, kids have moved away from smoking cigarettes and cigars, and they're getting their nicotine through vaping. The problem with that is they're getting higher concentrations of nicotine. So they become more quickly reliant on it. The other thing is it's a lot easier for these kids to be vaping in school than lighting up a cigarette.
Right.
They'll go off to the bathroom and pull out their vaping pen and take some nicotine through a vape and then head back to the classroom. And teachers don't know it. Many parents don't even know that their child might have a vaping pen with them.
Yeah, there's no smell. There's no hanging up the jean jacket and going, oh my goodness, what Yeah, you can't pick it up like you used to.
No, you can't. And that's why another reason why it's so popular.
One thing I was wondering about all this is what is the data, or what have researchers been able to find why some drugs come into fashion and vogue and then others move off of the scene? What's some of the drivers for that? Is it just a different high, a different experience, or is there something else going on that one set of drugs seems to become very in fashion for a period of time and others drop off?
Among the adolescent population, it's pretty stable, and it has been for decades. It's alcohol and marijuana, two of the most popular drugs in vaping now. There never has been, according to the data, there never has been a dramatic increase in some of these hardcore drugs. These are drugs that either are not readily available to the teenage community, or kids are just stay away from them. So you're not going to see high percentages of inhalants or hallucinogens or cocaine or heroin. You're just not going to see that within the teenage population. Now, part of that might be that those drugs just are not readily available to teenagers, or harder to get. And teenagers go for what's easy to get. And then, some of them just, are smart enough to want to stay away from it. But, for years, if you look at the data, it's consistently been alcohol and marijuana, and now vaping of marijuana and nicotine. Hardcore drugs, less than 5% of the teenage population.
Well, that's good news from a grandparent perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, knowing that, and it's not saying, hey, don't pay attention for that or turn your eyes away from it, but it's a little bit of like, this is probably a bad analogy. If you're out hiking, don't worry about getting struck by thunder if you happen to be in a thunderstorm.
Yeah,
It could happen, not likely to happen.
Yeah,
So
just be aware of it. Don't become paranoid over it, but just be aware of it, and just recognize what the data is showing. If you want to be concerned of something, be concerned with alcohol and marijuana and this vaping, and just the warning signs, and learn what you can about it.
sure, sure. That's great information for us. And again, this is great because I'm a new grandpa and I get to ask these questions and learn more. So I'm ready to handle things as the little tykes start to become older tykes and
Yeah, that's what you want to do.
and move
That's what
into
you
high
want to do.
school.
That's what you want to do. You want to learn about this so that you become more confident and less afraid of it. And you feel, that you hope you never have to deal with this, or that your grandkids never have to deal with it. But if they do, you can be a resource for them. And just as importantly, you can be a resource for their parents who may not have taken the time to learn about this or become prepared with it, and then are caught in a crisis.
Now, with we've been talking about the substances and some of the abuse and the use and the trends over the last few years. Has there been any studies or anything that has also gone on with internet usage and social media and some of those other items that you addressed in your book?
Yeah, that's an interesting topic, because I have done a few podcasts on the issue of social media in teens, um, where I talk about the trends that are going on with social media, and I give parents some tips on what to do with social media. And then I go over some of the research that has come out on social media. A lot of it from Facebook did a study on how social media is impacting teens, and some of that data is a little bit um, not only interesting but a little bit scary too. But there is no question that social media is something that every parent and every grandparent needs to be aware of, and these social medias that these kids are getting into, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn, well, not so much LinkedIn, but these social media are taking up so much of these kids' time. And what we're noticing is, particularly for girls, it's having a very negative impact on their self-esteem. Um, and the amount of time that kids are on these social medias, like TikTok, for example. Parents need to be more aware of these social media platforms that are out there, what their kids are looking at, the amount of time that their kids are spending on it, and how that social media is impacting their kids. Because some of this data is pointing out that it can have some negative effects. Now, that's not to say that there's not benefits to these social media, because there are. It's like everything, it's how you use it and how you deal with it. But parents just need to be aware of some of these platforms, and be aware of what their kids are doing on social media and why they're on social media.
Sure. And I think along with that is that there's been a little bit of information that's been coming out that has really showed how some of these social media companies really gamify the experience, and how it really drives it for, and I may be getting this endorphin kick in. If I do a post or a video and somebody likes it, then boy, I feel great. And you're always kind of then starting to search for that next hit. Now, one thing with this and with social media is, and it's a weird one, and you brought it up, is it's not always readily apparent that there's an issue. But how would a grandfather or grandmother or a parent know that there's becoming an issue with screen time or so much engagement or so much emotional wrap up in some of these things?
Well, before your child even gets on social media, I think you should have a conversation with that child, and ask them what social media platforms they want to use. What do they intend to use them for? What do they want to post? Um, and then check in with them from time to time to see how things are going. Simple questions, what have you seen on social media? Have you seen anything that you consider disturbing on social media? What are your friends saying about social media? Um, and then you want to limit their time so it doesn't become compulsive and interfere with family activities, dinner time, school responsibilities. Um, and I would recommend to any parent and to every grandparent, um, download these applications. Get on TikTok. Get on Facebook if you're not, although that Facebook's not popular, all that popular among kids. But get on some of these social media, especially things like TikTok and some of these others, and become familiar with them. I mean, some of them are entertaining. I've got TikTok. I go through it. It's pretty funny from time to time. But you want to be familiar with the application that your kids or your grandkids are using. Sometimes it might lead to you having a conversation with them of maybe something you saw on TikTok that you thought was amusing. It's a way of opening the door and talking to them. But as a parent, you should know what applications and platforms your kids are on. The other thing I would say to parents is, some of these platforms like TikTok, for example, a person can go in and they can create a private room, and they will let only certain people into that private room. And my recommendation is the parent is, and there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes a kid will just want to have, their own friends in a group, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I say to parents, if you're going to allow your child to have a private room, you have to have permission and access to get in that room. They cannot shut you out. You need to let them know that if they're going to do that, they have to give you permission to be in that group anytime you want. But just be aware that some kids create these groups, and parents are not even aware that they're created, and you don't know what's going on in those rooms.
That's great advice. And I hadn't even thought about those private rooms in requesting access, or at least being able to go in, check in there every once in a while, and then back out. And
exactly. I mean, you don't want to leave the impression that you're going to be sitting around watching everything that's going on. But just the idea that they know you can check in from time to time is probably going to send a message to them about, they better be careful.
Sure. With some of the other, I guess the last part that I have as far as talking about things that can be abused is gambling. And I don't know if there's anything within the youth, we've been talking primarily high school, that's really come to light as far as youth getting into bad situations with gambling.
Yeah, if you hold on a second,
Sure.
I just got some information on that.
The reason I was asking that is with so much sports betting now coming back online, and with so many other forms of gambling for entertainment, if there's that risk of really sucking in those teenagers into, again, getting that rush of a big win or the disappointment of a loss. And if we're starting to see teens fall into, becoming addicted gamblers.
Yeah, I think you raise an extremely important issue that parents and grandparents need to be aware of. And I just did a little bit of research on that myself not too long ago. And what I found from this is from the National Problem Gambling Awareness Week. And they cite that in general, between 60 to 80% of high school students report having gambled for money during the past year. 60 to 80% of high school students. And 4 to 6% of these students are considered pathological gamblers. In other words, they're addicted to gambling. And another 6 to 8% are at risk of developing a serious gambling problem or show signs of loss of control. The other thing they noticed is that boys are more likely than girls to gamble and experience gambling problems. For most parents and teens, gambling is seen as an innocuous behavior with few negative consequences. Another thing they noticed was that some signs of pathological teenage gambling is they like the rush. They like the rush of gambling. It's true for adults too. Um, it takes money, but then a kid will take money, but then makes desperate attempts to stay in the game by maybe writing IOUs. They'll try almost anything to stay in the game, and they really want to win that big one. So you raise a very, very important issue that I think parents and grandparents are not aware of, in that this issue of teenagers gambling is a bigger problem than I think we know is out there.
And that was where my head was at, was, in terms of what the data and everything that you provided, dealing with drugs and substances, is knowing that gambling can be another form of addiction and something that can definitely be abused, because my guess is that 60 to 80%, that's going to be your college basketball tournament pool, and that's going to be $10 in for the bowl tournaments, and picking some squares at the Super Bowl. Things where it's harmless. You're probably with a group of people. You may have your buddies in a pool, something along those lines that a lot of us probably partake in. But then, what was startling was we're floating around 10%. Just under 10% that are saying that they've got a real problem with it.
Yes. Yeah, the pathological problem. And I think you're absolutely right. I think there is so-called gambling among teenagers, and exactly doing what you're doing, betting on a basketball game, betting on the World Series, betting on who knows what, football, the Super Bowl, things like that. And those are once in a while type of activities. I wouldn't be too concerned about those. But then a small percentage of them cross that line and they get addicted to it, and they become almost pathological gamblers, where it's getting out of control. They're borrowing money, they're losing money, they're going into debt, maybe they're selling things, all of which are symptoms of what you see in adults that are addicted to gambling too. It has very severe negative consequences. Fortunately, it's a small percentage of kids, but again, it's an issue, as you bring up, Greg, that parents and grandparents need to be aware of, and just keep your antenna up. And if you spot some of these symptoms, maybe your kid's constantly asking for money, things like that. Just be aware of it.
Sure. And even just being able to have the discussion about it. You are having a big Super Bowl party and you're betting on what's going to be the first commercial of the Super Bowl. But that's a great opportunity to talk about, like, hey, this is fun, this is a safe environment, it's a couple of dollars, but as you're starting to get into high school, you might be tempted to put in larger amounts, and you might be tempted to engage more in this kind of stuff. So it's a good way to have that discussion with them, and be aware that almost 1 in 100, is that right? No, 10 out of 100, primarily high school age boys, are going to have some kind of a difficulty with gambling.
And you need to be concerned if a child is doing even what appears to be, every once in a while gambling, betting on this, betting on that. You just need to be aware that there's a potential it could get out of control. So keep your eye out for it. Keep an eye on it.
Sure. Rick, as we're starting to wrap up this conversation, I do want to ask you, what are some of the constructive ways that grandparents and parents can talk about substance abuse and even gambling and social media addictions without really creating a boogeyman? Or, as I referenced back, my high school and middle school youth, where, the health teachers were just, it was so outrageous what they were showing us, that we can be taken serious, that we can have that discussion with them without creating these weird boogeymen and stereotypes and all these things that really turn kids off.
Yeah, I think you want to keep the focus on you. Okay, not on the child. You as the parent, you as the grandparent. And it's okay to have a conversation with them about, how this whole issue of drugs scares you as a grandparent. You're scared. And it's okay for them to see that it frightens you, and to have a conversation with them and talk to them about how some of these drugs scare you, and how you feel they can be very dangerous, and see if they're open to having that type of discussion with you. You want to keep the focus on you, not on them, and so that they can see how some of this might affect you, and maybe that'll lead to a deeper discussion about what some of these drugs are. You can have a conversation about how you have heard that vaping is going on, in high schools, and ask them. I'm concerned about it. I've heard about it. What do you think about it? Have you noticed any kids vaping in school? What do you think about this? And they may tell you they don't think it's a big deal. They may tell you they think it's okay, and that's okay for them to say that. At least they're talking to you about it. You want to keep the communication open. You want to let them know that how you feel about this, and it's okay that you're scared. It's okay that you worry about it, and to see if you can have these kinds of conversations with them by keeping the focus on you and how it's affecting you.
Oh, that's great advice, because then it doesn't really become awkward for them, or it comes across as attacking. This is grandpa telling them, like, hey, when I was in school, this is what was big, this was what was going on, and now I'm hearing these things and I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Are you concerned? What's going on?
Yeah, I heard about this thing going vaping. I heard this discussion. I heard people talking about this thing called vaping, and I learned a little bit about vaping, marijuana and vaping nicotine. What can you tell me about it? I've heard about this. What can you tell me about it?
Yeah.
And I'm concerned about it. I don't know about you, but what do you think about it? And see if you can get them to sort of respond to it. You'd be surprised at what you might find out.
Yeah, well, I'm going to need their help to make sure grandpa doesn't fall in with the wrong crowd.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they may say, hey, grandpa, you don't want to deal with this stuff.
Right. No, that's awesome. Hey, Rick, is there anything about the updated information about addiction and substance use that I haven't asked you that you feel is important that we need to touch on?
Just that I would encourage every grandparent that listens to our conversation, and every parent, to learn the warning signs. And I have them in my book. I have warning signs for a child that might be smoking marijuana. I have warning signs for a child that might be drinking alcohol. I have warning signs for a child that might be developing an eating disorder. I have warning signs for a child that might be self-injuring themselves, because in some cases, not all, but in some cases, a child might be developing an eating disorder or self-harming themselves in addition to, using a substance. And self-injury is very much under the radar. This is not something that parents catch very quickly, because kids are clever. They know how to hide the cutting that they're doing or the burning that they're doing. It's not obvious in a lot of cases. When I talk to parents, when I was at Menninger Clinic and I would go through their child's history of using substances, they would look across at me in many cases and they would say, I had no idea this was going on. Or if they did suspect their child was using a substance, they might say, I sort of knew something was going on, but I didn't know it was this bad. And these are good parents. These are good parents doing the best job they can. They missed the warning signs because nobody told them what to look for. So my primary motivation in writing this book was to help parents know what those warning signs are. Because if you know what the warning signs are, the more likely you are to catch something and intervene at an early stage, which is what you need to do. So my advice to parents, learn those warning signs.
That's great advice. And folks, the book is The Addicted Child, and I'm going to be putting links to Rick's website and that book, as well as our conversation that we've previously had, into the show notes. So you can go back and listen to that, where we really focused on the book, The Addicted Child. And then, you've got a lot of information at your fingertips that you can use in helping to guide and mentor those kids that are in your lives. So thank you for that, Rick.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate your contributions to the discussion, and I hope that everyone that listens to us, has learned something and enjoyed the conversation. I know I have.
I have too. Every time I talk to you, I'm learning just a lot of information that I know is going to pay off in the future.
I hope so. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I enjoyed this conversation with Rick. I really do appreciate getting this up-to-date information about what's going on with the middle school and high school youth when it comes to substance abuse. I mean, statistically, we're probably more likely than not going to have to help our family and our grandchildren through one or more of these types of issues. So it's always great to have information versus going off of past memory and details that might be 30, 40 years old, or completely incorrect assumptions made. I really hope that you enjoyed this conversation as well. So I do have a list of the chart that Rick had shared to me that summarizes some of the detail from this Monitoring the Future survey that went out to those school kids. And so you can go to the show notes and you can find that table. It will list out the 3-year trend, and you can see for yourself kind of where things are going. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I hope it helped you out. And please be sure to share this conversation with somebody else that may have those middle school and high school age grandchildren, so that they have information that they can use to help support those kids and those families. So until next time, remember to stay cool. Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.